All right, folks, good afternoon. I'm gonna say it one more time. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for being here. If you are at the congressional briefing, serving Latino communities in uncertain times, nonprofit responses to federal funding priorities, federal funding challenges, and you're in the right place. We have a hybrid format, so that's why we're navigating the logistics. So you're gonna see me addressing also folks who are looking at us through Zoom, but I'm also addressing you guys as well. So I want you to feel welcome as well. My name is Brian Rosa Rodriguez, and I have the pleasure of working in partnership with Grupo Nexos, who is co-hosting this briefing alongside Nydia Velázquez's office. And we wanted to bring you a great set of panelists and an expert to talk about funding priorities, specifically government funding priorities that have been changing this year, and how is that impacting Latino communities and nonprofit organizations that serve Latino communities across the nation. So as part of the briefing, I want to make sure that the folks are looking through Zoom, that this is a Zoom that is being recorded. And most of the talks that we're going to have here are going to take into account any questions or concerns that you may want to express through the chat function in the Zoom meeting. So feel free to jump in and ask and engage throughout the briefing so that you can get your voice heard through this open space. At the same time, I want to make sure that you folks in the room are able to, draw down notes. And if you have questions and concerns, we'll have a section full for you guys to ask questions and interact with the panelists as they speak as well. So I wanted to excuse first, Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez is being called in for a very important meeting. So she might not be able to join us at the beginning of the conversation. So hopefully we'll hear from her or from her staff at some point throughout the briefing. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I want to make sure that folks on the Zoom are able to also share. There we go. Everything is working out great. Awesome. Awesome. All right. So I want to first pass it to Laura. Laura Tomasco, who's the Senior Policy Manager at the Urban Institute, and she's going to walk us through some research around financial risks for nonprofits losing government grants. So I'm going to pass it over to Laura.
All right. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Tomasco, and I'm the Senior Policy Program Manager and the lead of the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy at the Urban Institute, where we produce and publish high-quality, rigorous data, insights, and research on nonprofits and philanthropy. And thank you to Congresswoman Velázquez's office and Grupo Nexos for having me here for this data briefing today. So this year, when news of federal funding cuts and cancellations and pauses hit, we wanted to understand the prevalence of government grants. And we wanted to understand what it might mean for nonprofit organizations if they were to lose their government grants. So to better understand this, our team published an interactive tool that allows users to understand the financial risk of nonprofits losing their government grants in specific geographies, by size, and by subsector. And we built this tool using data from electronically filed Internal Revenue Service IRS Form 90 data that is available and free to the public. So today, all right, today my talk is going to have three parts. First, I'm going to talk about the nonprofit organizations in our data set. Next, I'm going to talk about the data sources that we're using to draw these conclusions. And then third, I will share the data on the financial risk of losing government grants for nonprofits, looking in three geographies, those headquartered in Puerto Rico, as well as predominantly Latino communities in New York and Florida. Okay, so important question. What are nonprofit organizations? So the IRS has many designations of nonprofit organizations. There's one designation, the 501c3, that people often think about when they think of nonprofit organizations. So C3s are charitable organizations. This also includes churches and religious organizations. It also includes private foundations. Our data set, the one I'm going to be talking about today, is focusing on charitable organizations, which I'm going to just refer to as nonprofits throughout the talk. And just wanted, before I dove into the data, just want to make sure folks know how diverse the nonprofit sector is. So nonprofits can range from food pantries and local health clinics to large research universities and hospitals. They provide day-to-day services and critical supports when disasters strike. They take care of the young and the elderly, and they help people gather and organize. And some nonprofits carry out their missions in local communities, and others support state and regional, national, and international efforts. Some nonprofits have few or no staff. They might rely mostly on volunteers to do their work. And other nonprofits are really large organizations that can have hundreds and even thousands of staff members. The other important thing to note is that nonprofits have diverse revenue sources. So some get donations from individuals, some get grants from foundations, some earn some earn revenue from fees they charge to participants, and some earn interest on money that they invest, and some also receive government grants and contracts, which takes us to the question that we wanted to understand, which is how many nonprofits receive government funding and what might happen if they lost that funding. So we can start to answer this question with data from the Internal Revenue Service. So each year, the IRS requires that public charities of a certain size, those with total revenue over 200,000 or more, or total assets of 500,000 or more, have to file the IRS Form 990. That means that nonprofits under that threshold that have either less assets or less total revenue do not have to complete the form. Instead, those smaller nonprofits will complete a form called the IRS 990EZ or that 990N. Some small nonprofits might opt to complete the full 990 form, which is great because we get some more data from there, but they're not required to do so. And some church-affiliated organizations also don't have to complete the Form 990. So the reason I'm going into the detail about who fills it out is I want to make sure that you have a sense of who is completing this form, because this form is the only IRS form that asks about the total dollar value of government grants that nonprofits receive. So that means we've got a good understanding of nonprofits of a certain size, whether or not they receive government grants, and any data we have on nonprofits under this threshold is not necessarily representative of that entire size category. And again, nonprofits that file the EZ or the N don't have to report any findings on government grants. And I also just want to point out some data limitations. So the IRS asks about the total dollar value of government grants. It does not break that down by level of government. There's not like a line for federal funding versus state funding versus local funding. So our data is going to look at sort of the aggregated look at government grants. But, honestly, even if the data were broken down at different levels of government, it's hard to completely parse out what comes from where. Like you can imagine federal funds that pass through states and then go out as state grants. You could also imagine local governments might have a mix of state and federal funding when they're making their grants as well. So, it's hard to say over. And then the second limitation is that there is not a line on the Form 990 that asks about government contracts or other sources of government funding. For that reason, we assume the government grants line is a little bit of an undercount because it might not be capturing the totality of money that nonprofits are getting from government. Okay, so how many nonprofits did we look at in our sample? So we drew our sample from tax year 2021 because this was the most complete year of data that the IRS had published, and we wanted to be able to build a tool that could be as comprehensive as possible across a lot of different geographies to show how many nonprofits get government grants. And in 2021, there were 1.2 million active public charities registered. And of that total, so that the pie is the 1.2 million. So of the total, over 323,000 filed the IRS Form 990, which is the data source that gives us information about government grants. And that is represented here in the blue slice right there. And of that 323,000, just over 100,000 said, yes, we have government grants. So you can imagine about a third of that blue slice is the data set that we're looking at here today. All right, so to understand the financial risk of losing government grants, our team at the Urban Institute Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy built an interactive tool that allows users to see the risk of losing their government grants. And this slide here lists the amazing team that work on putting the tool together. I want to give a special shout out to our colleague Thea Gessen, who not only helped to build the data set and build the tool, but he did all the extra analyses for today's presentation. So thank you so much to Thea for your work on this. All right, so if you have a chance afterwards, and I know those of you in person have some links here, you can go explore on the tool. You can look at geographies beyond the 3 that we're going to look at today. So we have all states, counties, congressional districts, and at the state level, you can break the findings down by those geographic units as well as by size and subsector of nonprofits to understand different patterns you might be seeing there. Okay, and now for today's briefing, so what we did was we took the data set from the interactive tool and we did some new analyses here. So we were interested in understanding for nonprofits who are headquartered in Latino communities in 3 particular geographies, what was the risk of them losing their government grants compared to the country and the state overall? And that takes me to our second data source, which is the American Community Survey. So to understand the situation for nonprofits located in predominantly Latino communities, we took 2 steps. So first, to identify predominantly Latino communities, we utilize data, ACS data here, which is a comprehensive ongoing survey from the U.S. Census Bureau, and it provides timely demographic insights, including counts of residents who identified as Hispanic or Latino across all the relative census tracts that we're looking at here. And for this analysis, we decided to define predominantly Latino communities as those that are at or above the average for the geography. So for New York, we looked at what the average for New York was, and if you were a community that was above that, we called you a predominantly Latino community. If you were below that, you were considered for our analysis like all other, basically there. This step was unnecessary for Puerto Rico, of course, as 99% of Puerto Rico is defined as Hispanic or Latino. Okay, so the next thing that we did here was looked at how many 990 filers in different geographies report receiving government grants. So for example, let's see, I think we're ready to move on. Oh, okay. So one more thing to note on this. So the next step, so I mentioned what we did, the ACS data to figure out predominantly Latino communities. And then what we did is Urban has like a geocoding engine that we use where we can geocode each nonprofit Form 990 filer and map it to a corresponding geography. And that is what lets us sort of say, this nonprofit is headquartered here in a predominantly Latino or not predominantly Latino community. And that's how we did our analysis. So 2 data limits to mention before I dive into the data. One is that we are using the ACS data as a proxy, right? So the Form 990 does not specifically ask a nonprofit organization to describe the demographics of the population it serves. So we cannot say that these are nonprofits that serve a Latino community. What we can say is that these are nonprofits who are headquartered in a predominantly Latino community. So it's not perfect, but I just wanted to put that caveat out there. All right. Okay. Now getting into our data here. Okay. So let me walk you through what we are looking at here. All right. So this is a table that I'm going to show you a few times over again. Sort of the highline message here is you can look at the United States data, and you see that a majority of the 990 filers, and that term 990 filer comes from the nonprofits who do file the 990 form, majority of 990 filers nationwide are at risk without their government grants. And as you can see here, let me just walk through because we're going to see this table a few times. I just want to make sure you guys know what all the columns are. So here in the first column, we've got the geography that lists the geographic unit we're looking at. The next column shows the percent of that population that identifies as Hispanic or Latino in the ACS survey. And then we list the number of 990 filers who report receiving government grants. The next column shows the total dollar value of those government grants. So for instance, if you're looking at the New York line, you see New York has almost $30 billion of government grants going to nonprofits. And then we show three financial metrics here. So the financial metrics are supposed to give a sense of the financial condition of a nonprofit when it has its government grants, and then what it looks like without those government grants. So the median operating surplus with government grants, you can see that when nonprofits in these different geographies have their government grants, they have a little bit of an operating surplus. And an operating surplus means that when the year ends, they have a little money left over that they can reinvest in their mission the next year. That gives them a little bit of a cushion, right? These are not huge operating surpluses, but they're a little bit something here. You can see here that Puerto Rico has a lower, sort of the typical nonprofit in Puerto Rico has a lower operating surplus at the end of the year than nonprofits in these other geographies. And then the next calculation we did was, well, what if we took away those government grants? What would what typical nonprofits operating surplus look like? And it's actually a deficit, right? You see here, everything is a negative number. So for the country overall, a typical nonprofit would have about 13% deficit without its government grants. And as you can see, the number for New York is pretty similar. Florida is a little higher. Puerto Rico is significantly higher, right? That's a much bigger deficit that a nonprofit would have to make up if it lost its government grants to be able to maintain its same level of programs, services, staff, and everything that it was doing with the previous budget. And then this final column looks at the percent of nonprofits in that geography that are at risk of falling in the red. So basically, like the share of nonprofits that would have a negative operating surplus were they to lose their government grants. And the story across the country is 60 to 80% of nonprofits, sort of state, like when you look at every state, would have a deficit without their government grants. And the average for the country is 67.3%. And then here you see again, New York and Florida is mainly in line, but you see the percent and share of nonprofits at risk in Puerto Rico is much higher here at 84.2%. Okay. Next slide here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to do some deep dives into New York and Florida and Puerto Rico to see what the data looks like there. So the first line here is just New York-wide data, same data we saw on the last slide. And then we took sort of the median of predominantly Latino congressional districts, right? So I described that a predominantly Latino congressional district is defined as one that has a population at or above the New York average. And so we looked at what is the at-risk profile for that group of congressional districts versus congressional districts in New York that are below the state average for a Latino population there. And then below that, we've pasted what the numbers look like for congressional districts that have a Latino population over 30%. And what we see here is that more New York 990 filers in Latino congressional districts are at risk and they have a higher deficit for a typical non-990 filer than other congressional districts. So you can see here, I've highlighted in red some of the numbers. The numbers are, they're different. They're not dramatically different, maybe like the ones we saw in the last slide, but we see some differences here. And then I've also highlighted for the congressional districts, you can see the ones that come in with a low operating surplus if they have their government grants, and you can see just like very large numbers that look different from New York's overall and the United States overall were they to lose their government grants. All right, and now we wanted to take a look and understand, like, congressional districts have a lot of different geographies in them, right? What would it look like if we took New York City, for example? And we looked at sort of the 5 counties there in New York City to understand what the data was. Like, as you can see, when we did the analysis of predominantly Latino counties and all other counties, the numbers were not, dramatically different. But what you can see here is, within New York City, certainly some disparities by geography, and you can see the Bronx County has a larger share of 990 filers at risk. You can also see in Queens County, almost 24% deficit a typical nonprofit would have to make up were they to lose their government grant. All right, now we're going to move on to the Florida findings. So, like New York, we analyzed congressional districts that were in predominantly Latino areas compared to congressional districts that were not in predominantly Latino areas. We saw some differences, not enormous ones, but you see the highlighted in red there for predominantly Latino congressional districts. Your typical nonprofit would have a higher deficit, and a higher percentage of nonprofits in that area would be at risk of having a deficit were they to not have their government grants. And then when we look at congressional districts, you can see, again, this is all congressional districts that have a Latino population over 30%. And again, you can see these numbers are very high, particularly when you look at the potential deficit without government grants. And you're seeing a lot of numbers here in the 30s and even 40s, which are not numbers when we looked kind of at the country overall, right? All right, and now we take a look at metro areas in Florida that are predominantly Latino. And what we see here, when we did our, predominantly Latino metro area versus all other metro areas, the data looks very similar there. But what's interesting is when we looked at the top Latino metro areas in Florida, what we noticed is that the share of 990 filers at risk without their government grants is actually increasing as the share of Latino population increases in Florida. So you can see here, for example, in Naples, Marco Island, Florida, about 55% of nonprofits would be at risk. When you're looking at Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, that has 46% Latino population, that at-risk number jumps up to 73.2. And similarly, the potential deficit of not having your government grant would be -3%. So that's a deficit certainly in the Naples area, but it's -20% in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, which is just a larger sum of money that the nonprofit would need to make up to maintain their same amount of work. All right, and now we're going to look at Puerto Rico here. So I think one important thing to note is you'll see here in the slides is that the nonprofits, I should say the 990 filers that are based in the San Juan metro area are really driving the data here. So you can see of the 297 990 filers in Puerto Rico, 220 are located in the San Juan metro area. So basically the data points for San Juan really mirror what you're seeing in Puerto Rico overall. But it's interesting to look at the other metro areas. The numbers are certainly small, right? Because again, most are congregated in San Juan. But you see very stark numbers in terms of the potential deficit that nonprofits could have without their government grants. And you see extremely high percentages of nonprofits at risk were they not to have their government grants. So that takes me to the end of my presentation. The 990 data is really terrific for being able to drill down in specific geographies and understand what's going on. But again, there's the limits in that it's focused on government grants. It doesn't disaggregate by different types of government funding. The Center of Nonprofits and Philanthropy at Urban Institute also has a nationally representative panel study of nonprofit organizations. We do this study in partnership with American University and George Mason University. It's the only nationally representative survey of its kind. And we have just closed our 5th year of the panel. And In this survey, we have asked nonprofits questions about, have you lost government funding? Have you had your government funding frozen or canceled, and the impact that's had on the organization? So we are just diving in and starting to analyze that data. So look out for more to come from us that will provide more of a picture of what is happening to nonprofits. And if you have any questions, I'll be around for the Q&A and happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that amazing presentation. I wanted to now invite the community panel to join me up here. So we're going to have a sort of a conversation, reacting a little bit to what the data that we just heard, but also I think the very first thing that we should do is do proper introductions for the panelists who are with us today. So starting from this side all the way to that end, can you please just tell us your name, the organization you work for, and what inspired you to come here and talk to us today?
Hi, everyone. I'm very thankful to be here and great to see all of you. My name is Julieta Lopez. I am the Vice President for Federal Advocacy and Network Mobilization at Hispanic Federation. We were founded in 1990, headquartered in New York with offices in DC, of course, Florida, New York, Puerto Rico, as relevant to this conversation, but additionally also in Illinois, North Carolina, Connecticut. And as of this year, we opened in California as well, in LA. We are a multi-issue member-based organization. We have over 800 members and partners across the country, which are nonprofit and community-based organizations. We're very much a focus and listening on people on the ground to inform both the programs that we run and our policy. And then, yeah, I'm happy to be here. And this is Hispanic Federation is a very large organization with resources, and even we are feeling all of the cuts that are going on in a very real way. So happy to be part of this conversation with my colleagues.
Good afternoon. My name is Pablo Blanc. I am the Director of Immigrant Integration with CASA. CASA is a nonprofit organization who is celebrating the 40th anniversary now in September. And we are now based in Maryland, that is our hometown, and then Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Georgia as well. We are a membership-based organization, and we have 170,000 all-time members. And we have very predominantly cases now in the news with Abrego Garcia. We are defending him. We are working on birthright citizenship and TPS and all of that. But also we do services, and my work is in the service side. We have citizenship programs, free tax preparation, and financial education. Those are the programs that we do. Some of them with federal funds.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Marisaida Sanchez Cesario, and I'm the CEO of Grupo Nexos, a nonprofit organization based in Puerto Rico that houses around 200 social scientists. And we work with community members, with government, universities, private organizations in health promotion and evidence-based practices, ranging from mental health services to home visiting programs. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those introductions. Aren't they great? We should give them a round of applause. Thank you for saying yes to the invitation. And I guess the first thing that I wanted to kind of ask you is related to this notion that there's cuts to programs and services. And if you could elaborate a little bit more, how does your organization is feeling those cuts? And if you can provide any examples or data around exactly how this gap is impacting the work that you're doing in community. I want to start the same order.
Yeah, and I had mentioned, right, Hispanic Federation, we're lucky we have a lot of resources. We have a very diverse portfolio in terms of our funding. With that being said, though, right, we have already lost over $89 million in federal funding from different agencies, right? That goes from USCIS, NTIA, USDA, Department of Energy, EPA, from many different situations, and there's about 8 million more that we have classified as high risk of could be pulled from other agencies. And there's different iterations as to how we've dealt with that, right? Some of it, there were some programs after the election that we were able to speed up a little bit of the processing and moved up some timelines to try and spend out as much of it as we can in anticipation. All of that was not obviously able to be spent out, but we were able to do more. Some of the money that was awarded, but never actually given to us, right? It was stuff that the Biden administration had approved towards the end of the term, and then we never actually got that money. So in that sense, right, we had programs that we were looking forward to launching that were going to be part of our community work and expanding a lot of that. The NTIA grant was a very big one that a lot of our partners were a part of, and doing a lot of digital equity in the time when it's very needed right now. As the president just put out the AI framework, it seems, I think, as we were all talking, right? So there's been different iterations of that. And then, other projects we're looking to see how we can fill in those gaps, right? To make sure that we can have that program continuing. It's really important for us to be able to still have those resources. But obviously, diverse funding is a very important part of it. We've been looking at different options with, foundations, going around and everything, but everyone's clamoring for the same foundation money, right? And trying to be strategic, working in partnership. And, some of the programs that we do have in that high risk category that we're concerned about, right, have programming planned for 2026 through 2028. So now trying to figure out how we're going to fill a lot of those gaps is definitely a top priority, but other things that we've been looking at is how, before we even thought about the funding conversation, there's the bigger conversation of there's a legal questions that we need to answer every single day. And when our CEOs of nonprofits, right, usually are spending time with funders and looking for great new avenues to do all this program and great policy work, we're not stuck talking to lawyers all day, right? Our senior teams are talking to lawyers, figuring out things, right? Things like the Homeland Security investigation, which Hispanic Federation was one of the people that received, one of the 200 organizations that received the letter, looking into essentially accusing us of causing the border crisis because we received immigration money, right? And some of the organizations that were on that list actually have never even received federal funding, right? So these are all tactics that are being used to, while funding is being pulled away, we have to be focused on other things and not even focus on that. So it's definitely been a process going along, but we're moving forward and looking for different options and happy to talk about some of those more strategies throughout the conversation.
Thank you. Same question.
Sure. We also have a diverse pool of funding, but that includes federal funding. And for example, we have a $1.7 million grant for AmeriCorps. And AmeriCorps was terminated on April 25 without any announcement. So 32,000 members, individuals who were serving their community members, were immediately terminated. And then after that, some attorney generals, 23 attorney generals, filed a lawsuit against that termination. The judge finally, a little bit late for my taste, decided that was unlawful and ordered AmeriCorps to call again to service the AmeriCorps members, but only for the states who filed the lawsuit. The states who did not file the lawsuit could not call back their members, right? So that all of these details I'm sharing is because in the same way that business and for-profit organizations need certainty, need stability to run their business and to know what the rules will be tomorrow, so I can do my plans and I can get my profit. The same rule applies for nonprofits. Nonprofit needs stability, needs certainty, needs to know where the funding will come, right? So any big change of funding without announcements will impact nonprofits in the same way, and will impact in the for-profits will impact the clients, and we impact the people that we serve as well. It's not only the nonprofit, it's the nonprofit that exists only to serve people, right? So if the organization is impacted, then we cannot serve people. And that was what we for example, what we miss in the AmeriCorps termination narrative is that we know that 32,000 people were terminated, but we don't know how many people stopped receiving services, right? So how many kids were going to school, to after-school programs run by AmeriCorps members, and now those kids have to walk to their homes and stay there by themselves until their parents can come back later after work. And what is the risk of those kids being there by themselves, right? So now is speaking about the huge impact that the community is suffering because of this grant terminated. We also have, for example, a USCIS grant that we won because we wanted to explore. There are 9 million people who are green card holders in the United States, and they don't apply. Even though they can apply today, they don't apply to become a US citizen. So we were exploring, we presented a research model for USCIS, to USCIS, so we can do outreach in a different way and see what happens, and see if we can reach out to those 9 million people, a segment of them, and invite them to naturalize. And we were doing that project, and the project was doing very well, but unfortunately our grant was terminated, so we cannot complete the innovation. That was an innovation grant, right? So from USCIS. So that is also an impact, right? So when nonprofit organizations are trying to innovate and trying to think again how we can do better our job, how can we better serve our population, we receive these cuts, and then everything goes to square minus 10. So those are the impacts that when we lose funding, not only the organization, not only the staff, but all the community suffer from those funding cuts.
Hey, Mari, same question for you.
Yes, so I think I want to answer the question in 2 layers. First, in terms of Grupo Nexos directly, we lost a $12 million 10-year grant from the National Institutes of Health. The funding stream was eliminated, which impacts actually 25 sites around the nation. And it was the first time the federal government had invested money over such a long period of time to work on structural changes driven by community-based organizations. So it was a very creative, innovative funding stream. In the case of Puerto Rico, our project was focused specifically in the eradication of child poverty. And so as you can imagine, the impact of that, the multi-level impact of that, our project was focused on the poorest part of Puerto Rico, the southwestern region, 21 municipalities, where 80% of children live under poverty. So as scientific partner of a large group of organizations in Puerto Rico, our network expands over 80 organizations. We have seen great variety from groups who have lost almost all of their funding to other groups who have lost half of their funding. We did a survey among our partners about a month and a half ago. Out of those, 3 organizations reported experiencing funding loss. 7 were waiting to hear, and 3 of them said they were uncertain. In terms of areas of services, anything from educational services to mental health services to multi-service organizations who do housing, home visiting, economic development. And I also wanted to mention the effect on that on first responders and workforce, because it doesn't only impact the citizen who receives the services, but also the people who are employed by the nonprofits and are supposed to be there as first responders. I'm talking about teachers, social workers, psychologists. And so a lot of our work has to do with secondary trauma, particularly focused on workforce. So I think that has had a great impact too, in terms of how capable our workers are going to be to provide these services given the uncertainty of their own jobs. So I'm sure we'll continue to go deeper, right? But I'll stop there for now.
Right, this is a very rich conversation. I'm gonna do something different that I did not rehearse, so hopefully it'll go out well. I want to follow up first with you, Mari, on that end. We heard today how it can be very different, the experience or the impact of losing government grants depending on where you are in the community that you are. And in particular, Puerto Rico seems to be, according to the data, a very vulnerable situation in terms of losing if they lose their grants, they might have to really cut services or even close down the nonprofit. Could you elaborate a little bit more? How is Puerto Rico different than the other localities? And do you know that what are the other responses, or what are other nonprofits doing to respond to that cut?
Thank you for that question, Brian. I think I want to start by saying that context does matter. And that even though the landscape certainly affects the whole nation, it particularly affects certain communities because there are some assumptions that might not be true equally across the country. For example, states like California, New York, and Illinois, we're all facing these new approaches from the federal funding, but some states might have some cushion or leeway with their own state funding to perhaps while we get adapted to this new reality, cover some of that funding gap, while some other jurisdictions like Mississippi, Louisiana, or West Virginia have less wiggle room, right? Because they don't have as much revenue coming into the state. And then when you go into territories like Puerto Rico, which is the most populous territory in the United States, the assumption that we have state funding that could cover certain investments in community, it's not true. For example, if we were to take the home visiting, maternal childhood funding, there's an assumption that there's some redundancy in the funding streams, and that is certainly not a reality for Puerto Rico. If Puerto Rico stops receiving the maternal child health funding, federal funding, our mothers and babies will have no backup. So I think, I could go into many more examples, but I think that one kind of illustrates what I'm referring to. Context does matter, and we're not all contextually the same.
Thank you for that. Can you add to that?
Yeah, and with that example, right, with the New York City Council this year, we had already lost some of our federal funding because we were headquartered in New York and worked so well with so much of the council, right? We were able to talk to them about the realities of some of our programs that are being run in New York because of federal funding would have to end. So they were able to put us into the budget at a larger percentage this year than they probably had originally planned to, knowing that we did have a lot of federal funding to fill that gap for New York, right? But then in Florida, that is not going to be the case, right? We are not going to have that.
Yeah.
And a big thing, and even more so in Puerto Rico, right? We know that funding doesn't exist, right? It's not about the government deciding how they're going to distribute it. The funding just doesn't exist. But also, right, I think there's a larger pressure on nonprofits in Puerto Rico in general, right? And that's also why Hispanic Federation wants to always be there, to be a convener, to be able to guide people through these processes as well, because the complications and the realities of how nonprofits need to go through all of these hoops just to be able to open their doors and serve the community is different depending on where you are regionally, for sure.
I wanted to actually, my next question was for you. You talked about the work that you're doing across the nation in Latino communities, and we've just heard that there are differences between how this impact is felt. Have you talked to your colleagues or member organizations? Have they answered survey or questioning around what the impact of these losses or cuts in funding are? And can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
For sure. Yeah. So, we've been, I think, probably since the beginning of the year, spent a lot of time, and our regional teams and our capacity building teams have spent a lot of time individually talking to our membership, doing all the surveys, doing all those things to get a full idea of, we had an idea of where they would have lost some federal funding. We also, one of the big things for us, right, it's not just Hispanic Federation's programming and our doors being open. We know that so much of the community, our members and partners, are reliant on the money that we subgrant to them. And that's honestly, I think, where more of the panic came from internally for us, right? It wasn't about the HF dollars. It was about the dollars that we knew were not going to go back to the community that we work for every single day, right? And one of the things that we've done with that research, and all of the surveys that we've done, is we started a new fund for our members and partners called the Rise Up Fund, that we've been working in conjunction to see who really needs the money. Everyone does, but right, who needs the money to be able to keep those doors open, to be able to do the essential services that they're doing every day. So we've been working with our regional teams to be able to give out different awards, and are in that process right now. So that has been one of the ways that we've been able to do that. But again, not every organization has that privilege to be able to move funds to be able to do that, right? We had an emergency fund that we tapped into for this emergency.
And Pablo, similarly, along those lines, what have been any strategies that CASA has been employing to kind of navigate these uncertain times?
So, in addition to pursuing different funding streams that, as it was said, everybody is trying to do the same and the pool of money is the same. So it's very difficult to get additional funding at these times, but we are trying. Also, we are considering, okay, what services do we need to continue providing, or what services we should not continue providing, right? So we are looking into our organization and see and expanding that, but also we are changing the service model in many cases. For example, we are replacing the AmeriCorps model that we have for citizenship program, inviting more volunteers to come. Is totally different. Is a totally different approach. Volunteers are beautiful, but also if it rains, they will not go. They will not show up, right? So AmeriCorps will always be there, even if it is a snow. So it's different, the model. We are changing totally the model. We are creating new volunteer management models and softwares and things like that, so we can creatively continue serving the community.
Okay. I wanted to stick to those adaptive strategies that one of those being attracting volunteers to do the work. We know that federal transitions invite also changes in the way that ideologically government is run and priorities change. So this is not necessarily different than any other transition that we had before. But I think, or I suspect, makes this one very different is that it's only been 6 months, and it feels like the changes have been happening very fast. So, Mari, can you talk a little bit more on how this time around feels very different, and how that could really harm the idea of efficiency? Because what we're talking about is maybe becoming more efficient in the way we deliver services, which we all should want. But at the same time, the time in which this is happening, such a short-term notice, a lot of mistakes could be taken, and like you said, a lot of services might be actually being restructured or changed or not done at all.
Yeah, I think for us in Grupo Nexos, being a group of social scientists, we're very much into KPIs, measurement, efficiency. But what makes this different is the speed and pacing. Just to give you a couple of examples. First, the fact that the cancellation notifications are immediate. In my 30 years of career, I had never gotten a termination letter that said it is immediately terminated. Therefore, the capacity of the receiver of that funding to do the transition, both administratively as well as service-wise, it's greatly impaired. And that in terms means that it might affect the service that is being provided. Secondly, in terms of the way the funding it's coming out now, typically we had 30 days to submit applications. Now applications are 14 days. And so not necessarily the ecosystem of nonprofit organizations, not all organizations are going to have the capacity to be able to submit competitive grants in a 14-day window. The other thing, and I think Julieta was talking about this, is how do you balance having to deal with the closeouts that are happening so rapidly while in senior leadership at the same time provide the services? And does the senior leadership of a nonprofit organization has the capacity to understand the legal nuances of what does it mean to get these letters? How do I go to my board of directors? Should I file an appeal or not? How do I do that? How do I write those letters? How do I follow up with the federal funder? So these are all things that are new, and they're all happening simultaneously. And the last comment I'm going to make is the diversification of funding streams. In the case of Grupo Nexos, we were lucky in the sense that it was part of our strategic plan to diversify our funding stream, and we started doing that prior to these changes. But I would say we're atypical in terms of our capacity to adapt, to be limber, and to do all of these things simultaneously.
Yeah. And I also, for context for folks to know, how many folks work at Grupo Nexos?
About 200 social scientists.
Right, so it's not a small group of people. You have many projects as well.
Yes.
The ability to adapt becomes even more complex.
Yes.
When that happens.
Yes.
But I think that it was said at the beginning that was about efficiency, but we know that it wasn't about efficiency, right? Because there is not a more efficient program than AmeriCorps, because AmeriCorps includes matching funds from the private sector, the decision of the governor of the state about what grants to give and what grants will not be receive awards. So there was a very efficient way. It could be improved always, but there was efficient. So it was ideology, not efficiency, what triggered all these changes. And that is why probably it was so fast, because it was easier the ideology works faster than efficiency, I guess. So that was that fast. And that is what is many times sad also in the field is that you have wonderful programs doing wonderful things, working very well, that can be role model for many other programs, but those programs are being cut, right? Because of ideology, not because of efficiency. And that is also happening.
That's a bumper sticker right there. Ideology was faster than efficiency. That's not
Yeah.
I wanted to, and I'll maybe, I have 5 minutes for this section before we go to Q&A. And I know we've been talking about the problem, but I want to see if we could find a way to draw a picture of the future that is better. What does success look like for Latino serving nonprofits in this context? What are the ways that you think we can weather the storm and continue doing the work that we need to do? And do you believe that that's possible?
Absolutely. I think for us, our work has always been driven in the belief that if you want to change the ecosystem and landscape of community, you have to work in partnerships. So for us, working from a collective impact model has always been the way to go. And I think now it's even more important to do so. And so I think bringing together or strengthening our private-public partnerships is vital. Also working very closely with our funders, our colleagues, both at the federal level as well as the foundation level. It's really important so that we can then maximize and also to invest in what we know works. I'm a scientist, so I'm always thinking of what are evidence-based practices that are contextualized, right? Because it's not the same to do work in New York or in California, in Puerto Rico, in Hawaii, in the Midwest, in the southern regions of the country. So that's important too. So I think I'm an eternal optimist, and I do think we will survive this. And things will not be the same from this point forward, though. So that's my 2 cents. I don't know, my colleagues, what do you think?
Yes, we will survive for sure because the community will survive, right? So the community will survive and we are there with them. So we will survive. I think that is also a great opportunity for all the nonprofits to think again their business model, their service model. So we even though we have been efficient and we have good models, again, creativity will come when you don't have the resources. Creativity will come and will help us to find new ways to continue serving the community and with the community.
Yeah, absolutely, yes, to, what my colleagues have said, and I think, yeah, working in community has been one of the biggest things, I think. A lot of the national Latino leaders have been meeting together to figure out, do we need to pull a resource fund, right? So that when our smaller organizations need that help, right? Who are the legal people that we need to speak to? Who are going to be the experts in this situation, right? Because obviously we all have legal teams, but maybe our legal team isn't equipped to handle the Homeland Security investigations that all of a sudden we're part of, right? And in addition to some of the things that Mani had said, right, also, Hispanic Federation takes money from the private sector, right? And that is definitely one of those pieces that I think we don't have data on, right? We don't know where we're slowly starting to build up data on who's losing federal funding, how much is being lost and all of that. But the private sector donations, and right now it's very anecdotal evidence, some of it from HF, some of it from our colleagues, right? But it varies. Some people have just pulled their funding, right? After the president's DEI announcements, right? That we saw corporations who were doing it for, maybe not the right reasons. Some people doubled down and were like, no, this is actually essential to it. And we love those corporations. Some people have said, we want to keep giving you money. We just don't want to be a publicized sponsor because we have other things going on with the administration and don't want that to now be another reason, right? So there's fear, right? Even I think from our organizations, there's fear from the private sector, but I think, and especially that is one sector that needs to be held accountable for sure, right? And you guys have missions, you all had all of these things that you've put out throughout the last 10, 15 years. This is the moment, and also having Congress be clear, right? We have a lot of members of Congress who are in great districts where a lot of these companies are headquartered, making it clear that, you're in my district. I need you guys to be supporting the communities that I'm trying to serve. Because you also live in their district, right? HF, our New York office, is headquartered right across the street from the New York Stock Exchange. It is an uncomfortable situation to think about the fact that, the people right across the street are sometimes actively working against the programs that we're trying to work on. But yes, I think we're moving forward. We're collecting as a community and trying to be, working in community. I think that is going to be what gets us to that next level. And having advocates like you guys in Congress, right, to talk to your bosses and make it clear that we need the action and we need their voices. And even though, depending on whether you're majority, minority, all of those things are impacting it, but even looking at the state and local voice that you can have, right? You're a member of Congress going home and saying, no, the Florida government does in fact need to be funding and filling these gaps that I wasn't able to, right? And all of that stuff. So as all of us together, for sure, we can move forward.
Thank you for that. I want you to give a round of applause. Now we have questions, yes. But I want to also pull a share and invite Laura over here. Let's see how we can make some space for her.
Absolutely.
In case folks, and actually I have a question that came in through Zoom. You have a question too? I'm gonna do the Zoom questions first, and then I'm gonna address the ping pong thing. Okay. Okay, so the first question is actually for you, Laura. That's why I really needed you. And I'm gonna actually maybe pull up the slide of a table so you can maybe explain the question. So the person is asking, what does the percent risk mean? Would it mean the probability of risk that those nonprofits would cease to exist, or the percentage of nonprofits that at risk of ceasing to exist? or any other interpretation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So percentage at risk refers to the percent of nonprofits in that particular geography that would have a negative operating surplus were they to lose their government grants. So the at risk is just at risk of a negative surplus. Now, what comes next is going to vary on so many things. So you could imagine a scenario where you have a negative surplus of like -1%, and maybe you can make that up pretty easily and be able to retain your same services. You could imagine then if that deficit is 10% or 20%, that it gets to be a little harder. But that would, of course, also depend on things like, do you have diverse funding sources? Like, are you able to make adjustments to programs and services? So it does not necessarily mean that nonprofit will close down. It just means they will have to figure out how to make that money up. And there's, of course, a lot of different ways that a nonprofit could go about doing that.
Let me give an example of landing that in the day-to-day of the life of a CEO of a nonprofit. What that means is that I lose all cushion of transition between grants, because between projects, administrators of nonprofits, we have to ensure our insurance is paid, our lights are on, our rent is paid for, the salary of our staff. So all of the operational expenses in order for us to continue to provide service to the community. So if I lose that little cushion, I have no wiggle room to keep the services that are provided to community or ensure stability for the staff that in turn is provided essential services that don't only refer to food and shelter for certain communities, but also things like mental health services, services for pregnant women, for elderly. So it's a dire situation. And most nonprofits do not have necessarily a diversified portfolio of funding where they can draw upon or investments. The typical nonprofit does not have that kind of resource.
Hi, Felipe Franco with the ADKC Foundation. Laura, you kind of talk about the different non-for-profits based on zip codes and neighborhoods as a way of identifying them as Latino or Hispanic. And I wonder if there's any other way of capturing information more about which non-for-profits are really kind of Latino-led or Latino-focused. I mean, for example, I know New York data really well. Even though you have a lot of non-for-profits that have been impacted, it's actually only one or two Latino non-for-profits led in New York City to shower for space. So I mean, definitely all of the other non-for-profits that are actually not focused on the Latino issues. Is there a way to capture that? I mean, I'm concerned about at the national level in Puerto Rico, definitely probably in New York, those shrinking of the Latino leadership in the big.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and this is, I think, a little bit speaking to the limits of the IRS data, because the data we have from the IRS is the data we have. But I mentioned at the end that we have another data set that's also really terrific. It's called the Nonprofit Trends and Impacts Panel Study. It's an annual survey that goes out to a nationally representative group of nonprofit organizations. Urban does it in partnership with American University and Georgia Mason University. And what is very special about that is we intentionally ask questions in that survey that complement data from the 990 so that we can get a more holistic experience of the nonprofit sector. And without it being just like a survey that goes to a convenient sample and there's bias in who responds, we send it to a randomly selected group of people. And then we do, special statistical weighting at the back end to make sure it's actually representative of the sector. In that panel study, we ask questions about the demographics of the nonprofit leadership. We ask questions about the demographics of the board, of the staff. We also ask about communities served. So in that data set, we have the opportunity to explore, I think, what you're trying to get at, which is understanding the experience of maybe like Latino-led and Latino served nonprofits. And we can then, but we also ask them questions about their government grants and contracts. We ask them questions to understand what they get at the federal level, the state level, the local level. We ask about the percent of their revenue that is. And this year we've asked like a special module around what has been your experience and loss of those. So when that data comes out, I think there's a great opportunity to do an in-depth analysis looking at different nonprofit characteristics on demographics of leadership, staff, as well as community served to get closer than we can get with the ACS data, because it's absolutely limited. And I appreciate, you know,
I'm just concerned about the and I would like this back federation. It's actually shrinking
Yes.
number of organizations.
And wouldn't it be a wonderful study after, we were looking forward to your data of a quality, you know, what are the skill sets that are required now in this climate from leaders of Latino organizations? I would argue nothing that we were taught in grad school for sure, right? So it requires coming from a center that does capacity building and helps other organizations. This is a whole different new landscape that is going to require a whole different set of skills than ever before from us leaders of Latino organizations, any nonprofit, but for that matter.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Laura, but is there a date on right now?
Oh, absolutely. So we are working on, we just had the survey come and close in June. We've cleaned the data, and now we're taking a look at the data sets and comparing them year over year just to make sure we get kind of everything in line. We're hoping to wrap that process up in the next couple of weeks. And then what we are not going to do is like hold all the headline data until we write some big fancy paper. We are going to be releasing data kind of as quickly as we can in small little spurts. We will also do the big fancy paper, but we're not going to, we feel like this data is so important that it's not worth holding up for that whole process. So we need to, you know, get the data sort of ready for analysis. But like, I don't want to say an exact date, but like we would hope this summer.
Okay, awesome. I'm gonna go over here and then over here.
Thank you. My name is Rachel. I work for Congresswoman Velázquez. So I was talking to Pablo earlier, and he mentioned that CASA was preparing before the Trump administration won. So Pablo, I think that's very powerful because here, as I told you, Democrats were saying, "Oh, let's hope for the best," but then it happened, and we were like improvising. So I wanted to talk more about, you know, how CASA did this and how can that be an example for
Sure, thank you for the question. So when we have our strategic plan, 5 years strategic plan, but we were also saying, okay, depending the outcome of the election, the strategic plan may work or may not work, right? We may need a new set of strategies. So, and because we also suffered the first government and we know what we were coming, and we have that blueprint that they have, Project 2025 and all of that, that was very, very scary. We put the executive team, all the chief and directors, to think, okay, what if Kamala wins, and what if Trump wins, right? So we were doing sets, and we have people thinking in the services that we provide, the big picture of the funding, all the areas, what lawsuits, what rights they may want to take from us. We were thinking all of that and doing plans. And doing plans include talking to partners and identifying what attorneys will help us to do lawsuits in each different topic, building the teams and preparing all the organization, like security protocols in our centers, all of that. Right? So what if I show up in our center? So all of that, we start developing protocols, etc. So on January 20th, we were ready because we were planning for that. And the first day when Trump issued the executive order against the birthright citizenship, that same day we also filed the lawsuit because it was ready because of this strategic planning, right? So that is the way that we did it.
Here.
I'm from the Office of Representative, and my question is, right, you ended on this like hopeful question of what the future's gonna look like. And I kind of want to know, what is rebuilding look like, right, after this? Like, how do we make sure that all of these programs that exist now that are potentially lost and potentially changing, how do we get those back? How do we rebuild?
I can start. That's like a big question. Yeah, so I think, a lot of it is what we talked about, right? Being in community and being able to lean on each other. I think we are coming to a different place in the nonprofit space. And Rachel, your question reminded me quickly on a side tangent. During the first Trump administration, Hispanic Federation and many nonprofit organizations grew in astronomical amounts because civil society corporations were like, oh no, what is happening? And they started funneling money. That has not happened this time, right? The opposite has happened, as we discussed throughout the panel, right? So I think it's looking to see who are the people that need to be leading, right? It's also, a lot of our organizations have been having the conversation of, not everyone needs to be doing everything all of the time. Let's have the people who are, and a lot of us are doing everything great, right? Not to say anyone's doing anything badly or whatever, but the best of the best should focus on those things. And that way we can harness that energy, those resources to those people. But yeah, it's going to be a long process to make sure that whatever programs are being ended can then be revamped through state, local dollars, foundation dollars, whatever it is, but it's going to be a long process of working together to see who can really lead us. And I think a lot of people at this table will be part of that process.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to also jump to you, Mari, because as a researcher, stopping the research midway and then starting it really is not an easy way to continue building on a robust research methodology if you stop it midway. As a researcher, do you think that's something that we can restart? How would that look like for research?
I think for some of the funding that was caught, for example, we were in the midst of finishing a study that looked at elderly in Puerto Rico from different walks of life, whether they lived by themselves, they were geographically isolated, they were homeless or identified as LGBTQ+. And so we were able to finish this study with our own funding because we had some diversification, but it was difficult. Now, in terms of the other project that I told you about that look at child poverty, the same way, Nexos is atypical though, because our portfolio had been diversified. What we had to do is to continue the initiative at a smaller scale. Into the future, I think really working in groups is important. And when I say group, I'm not talking only about nonprofit organizations working with each other, but really working and continue to work into partnership with our federal funders as well as our private funders and donations. You have to have a diversified portfolio. There is no way to survive otherwise. And I think also what I was talking about having a diverse skill set as a leader of a nonprofit organization, you really have to know about legal aspects of things. You need to know about organizational development to take care of your staff, and not to mention your expertise areas. So this requires to be almost a Renaissance leader, so.
Also, I think that why we are so efficient, why we are doing a great job is because we have the trust of the community.
Yeah.
The community trusts on us.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to stay. We need to not disappear. We need to be here present and do everything that we can do so the community continue trusting on us. So when we will have more funding again, the trust will be there for us to continue being efficient, right? Because if we disappear today and we come back year from now with more funding, the community will not trust us and we will not be able to deliver anything and achieve anything, right? So being there all the time. The future is today, if you want another phrase. The future is today, and we need to stay there so we keep the trust of the community.
I have one more question before we go to closing remarks that came in through Zoom. And it's an interesting question. We kind of been hinting at it a little bit. It reads, because of the need of diversifying skills, is there a growth of resource exchange? With the ongoing changes with funding and service applications, I'd expect that NGOs will need to become more collaborative than ever before. Are we seeing in your positions a development of sharing information, financial consultations, or partnership connections? What can resource exchange look like today within the third sector?
I absolutely believe so. Not to say that we were moving in that direction, but I think the need is the mother of invention. So this need maybe has expedited collaborations. I'll give you a concrete example. We have been working in Puerto Rico for a long time to bring together everybody who manages big data. And we were finally able to bring together about 10 groups, public, private, universities, economists, behavioral health data managers like myself and my group, people who manage health insurance data. And we started Puerto Rico Open Data with the idea that we will help data users to make decisions based on evidence. And I am absolutely convinced that even though we had good momentum, the need of the moment really helped take that collaboration to the next level. I don't want to be romantic about it, right? Because that also requires for us to have the financial resources to be able to do that secondary data analysis. But absolutely, I think so.
And I think it's happening already. We have this week a meeting with another organization that we have been always parallels, serving the same population, but in different universe. And this week we met and we said, okay, what are the services that you are no longer being able to provide? Probably I can still do that. What are the services? How can we refer each other the clients, the people that we serve? So it's already happening, that kind of dialogue. I think that it will probably take time to see that implemented in the field, but the conversations are already there.
Yeah, and something, when we do our capacity building and legislative advocacy trainings around the country with our members and partners, one of the things that we say is you cannot do it all, right? You cannot be the comms person, the researcher, and also providing direct services to all of your constituents, right? Because let's be real, that's the CBOs that we work with are program people. They're direct service constituents every single day. So you have to rely on someone who has a full policy team like Hispanic Federation to right? Look at over there and be like, okay, the researchers, you guys have that information, or the comms teams, the consultants, all of those. We have amazing people who are focused on organizations that are focused on just that. So that has definitely been happening, those exchange of, and I think people have been letting go a little bit, right? I think there's always that desire and everyone wants to do everything. And of course, right, everyone's working very hard, but I think there has been a little bit more of the letting go of, we can't do it all. We need help. We have to work together.
And what better example than this table right here? Urban Institute, Hispanic Federation, CASA and Grupo Nexos. We came together, and when your data comes out, I have a feeling that we will have another of this.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. So let's just give another round of applause. Let's invite over Rachel Roman to give some closing remarks on behalf of her office. I'm gonna go this way.
Well, thanks everyone, especially to the panelists for their time. This was a very insightful conversation. The Congresswoman couldn't be here because of an immigration meeting. But thank you so much. I'm not gonna read all of this because we don't have a lot of time. But I do want to say that on behalf of the Congresswoman, our office is here. And to all the nonprofits that connected virtually, our doors are open. We don't have a lot of people, but we have, a lot of intent and the willingness to help. And one of the things we do it every day, and I know other offices and some of my colleagues are here, we share information from the CRS, GAO, Inspector General, we send oversight letters, we communicate with agencies, and sometimes we get results, sometimes we don't, but we still need to, to try. And, we're offering ourselves as a resource, and, we're all resisting in some ways, and we all face uncertainty. But I just want you to know that there are tools that we can use, and just let's keep listening to each other, collaborating, and thank you so much. So.